All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about a project that has been going on for a couple of years now. It's a collaboration between Brown University, the Rhode Island School of Design, and John Muir University. And it's basically about this. So we have collaborators from the field of paleontology who want to analyze the fluid dynamics surrounding the creation of dinosaur tracks. And basically, their problem was the standard tools that they had available for 2D desktop displays just weren't enough, weren't helping them solve the problem. So they approached us, and we decided to use a method called scientific sketching to help them to create effective visualizations in VR. So I'm going to explain to you what scientific sketching is, and then show you how we implemented it and maybe explain whether scientific sketching might be for you. So scientific sketching is a VR application design methodology introduced by Dan Keefe, who is actually sitting in the audience today, in 2008. And it basically addresses the problem of the really large design space that virtual reality offers for visualizations. And as we just heard before, right now we don't have that many tools available to tackle this design space, and there's not that much expertise between domain scientists and visualization experts. So to help in the exploration of this large design space, scientific sketching introduces artists into the mix with the rationale that artists are experts in using new display modalities and exploring new tools. And that's why the artists are put right in the center of the scientific sketching methodology, which basically has 5 stages. I'm just briefly touching over them now, and we'll give concrete examples later. So the first step is for the domain scientists to introduce their scientific data, their research questions, and the visualization problem at hand. Then the artists take over, and over the next 3 stages, generate more and more elaborate mock-ups and visualization concepts that could be applied. And finally, it's the computer scientists taking over, taking all these ideas and actually implementing them in a data-driven application. So one important thing to note is scientific sketching uses this concept of the artistic critique. Those are discussion sections that are usually held at art schools, where artists help each other to evaluate the merit of an artwork in very candid discussion sections, but they give very concrete feedback. And in scientific sketching, almost every stage uses this multiple times usually with all 3 groups involved. Just to make sure that the final outcome of the visualization is actually an effective tool to tackle the research question at hand. So far, work on this has mostly evaluated the helpfulness of the artists in this mix. Our contribution is that we are one of the first actual large-scale projects that uses scientific sketching from start to finish and creates an actual VR application in the end. So we were tackling a problem in VR flow visualization. As said at the beginning, we were approached by collaborators from the field of paleontology, and they were interested in studying dinosaur locomotion based on fossilized dinosaur footprints. And they create these large fluid dynamic simulations trying to match the simulation with the fossils they find in the field. And as artists, we use the students of the virtual reality design for science course that is offered from Brown University in collaboration with the Rhode Island School of Design. And over the course of 2 semesters, we got the help of 27 students. So the first step is the scientific introduction. And in our case, the scientists brought in their fossil data and different visualizations of that fossil data, for instance, CT scans, and also the fluid dynamic simulations that they are running with different dinosaur footprint motions and different substrate settings that they want to match to this actual fossil record. So with this background, our students jumped into the 3 sketching stages. The first one, called the paper sketch, is basically some very coarse visualization concepts that they come up with. Each student usually came up with 10 to 20 different concepts. And most of them were drawings, but some students opted to show 3D renderings or also sculpting models like with 3D printing and other techniques. In the second stage, the virtual reality sketch, each of the students took 1 or 2 of their concepts and started drawing them in a virtual reality drawing application. So we made sure that no coding is involved. This is all just artists sketching out their ideas. And in the third step, they basically just put 1 level on top of their VR sketch and create a mock-up of entire virtual reality application that uses their visualization concept. After that, it was basically my job and my co-author Josh Tveite's job to take all these visualization concepts designed by the artists, pick the ones that seem to be most promising and actually implement that as a data-driven application in our cave display room that we have at Brown. And this has been going on for 3 years. It's still more or less going on. We still have continuous critique sessions with our collaborators. And just to go through a couple of results, so there's a lot more in the actual publication. I've just picked out the 2 that were, I think, the most interesting ones. The first one is like a virtual reality take on Pathline visualizations. So some students had the idea to not just look at particle data directly, but actually follow the different particle trajectories. And since our collaborators were interested in comparing different sections of this volumetric data and their and find similar movements in different regions, we basically implemented a clustering method, an interactive clustering method, where the user selects 1 particle trajectory and the system will output all the clusters that have a similar trajectory shape. The other result that was really interesting was the idea of using Timesurfaces. Basically, what you're doing here is you select some particles, and instead of treating them individually, you triangulate them and create a surface out of them, and basically track the deformation of the surface over time, which looks a little bit like this. The idea here was to also impose like this gridded structure on top so that you can see the deformation of different cells. It worked really well, especially with horizontal layers like this, because the outcome here is in the end, at the end of the simulation, most of the time you will see exactly the shape of a footprint, and that's something they can actually compare to the fossil tracks that they find in the field. And as you can see here, during the implementation stage, we were also experimenting with different grid settings, each of which had like advantages and disadvantages with legibility or the ability to see the entire data set at once. The other thing that we actually came up with during the implementation step, it's also possible to use basically inverse time surfaces, where instead of defining a flat surface at the start of the simulation, we define this flat surface at the end of the simulation and track particle coloring and grid settings backwards in time. The advantage of this is that we see kind of a fate map where particles were coming from, and this can be directly compared to cross-sections of dinosaur footprint fossils, which was really helpful for our collaborators to evaluate their simulation results. So a short discussion about what we found in using scientific sketching to design all these visualizations is our collaborators noted that kind of parallelizing the visualization design step. Gave them a really good overview of what virtual reality is capable of. So they came in without any prior knowledge about virtual reality, and just seeing the different concepts developed by, in the end, 27 artists, helped them to really cover the majority of the design space available to them. And just by seeing all the different concepts, they were able to understand their own data better, or at least get new views on their own data. And finally, just seeing all these different ideas gave them the ability to pinpoint exactly what they wanted to get out of VR visualizations. So a couple of lessons learned from us in using scientific sketching was that the scientific introduction actually had a big impact on the range of designs and concepts that were developed by the artists. Basically, we had two different runs of this course. In the first run, our collaborators didn't have a lot of knowledge what they actually want out of their data, and had very free and open research questions, and that ended up generating a lot of different visualization concepts. And in the second run of the course, they had much better examples of what they wanted to get out of the class. And basically, just by showing more detailed examples of what they want, it restricted the artists to just come up with more iterative improvements of existing VR visualization methods, rather than something radically new. As I said, we had about 13 artists in both of these classes, which is a lot. And in the end, it also ended up creating some duplicate visualization results. So we suggest that you can drastically cut down the number of actual artists involved if you want to use scientific sketching yourself. And finally, something we did is in our sketching environment, we restricted the ability to import like pre-generated 3D models, and everything had to be drawn in virtual reality to force the artists to understand how to use virtual reality rather than just creating something in their usual tools and just importing it into VR. And that gave us really good outcomes in the end. So is scientific sketching for you? It really depends on your collaborators' problems. If they basically don't have tools available to solve their problem in 2D and have very open-ended research questions, that's actually a pretty good sign that they might be able to use scientific sketching. Because in the end, there's more than just the visualization that's the outcome for them. For them, it's really the understanding of how to use VR as a tool. And with that, I want to thank the students of this year's 137 course. Without this work, wouldn't have been possible, and I'm open for questions.
It's an interesting case study, that very, very curious case study. So if there is any question in the room, yes?
Who did the critique?
Huh?
Who critiqued?
So we had one professor from Rhode Island School of Design who was co-teaching the course, but the critique is basically the entire group as a whole. So other art students critiqued, or art students critiqued art students most of the time. And of course, the scientists were also in there, so if they saw something where kind of artists exaggerated what is actually visible in the data, that was also something that was critiqued about. But good question, thank you.
Hi, Brett Jackson from McAllister College. Very interesting work. One thing I thought was interesting is if you look at your final implementations, the most effective visualizations tended to have time involved, right? There was some sort of deformation of the particles over time. Did your sketching interface allow the artists to be able to indicate that or change over time in how they implement
Yes, so I didn't go into detail, but the VR prototype, so the most elaborate mock-up, actually had the possibility to have multiple frames where people could step through an animation. It had to be drawn by hand, so most of the students actually opted to do like 2 or 3 time steps, but it was possible and it was used by the students.
Sorry, if the time is very in limit, but just a quick question is possible, yes?
Just a quick question. I am very interested in modeling of the dinosaur leg. So is that a kind of musculoskeletal model, or?
So the leg that I showed here is actually not a dinosaur leg. They were using the foot of a guinea fowl as a stand-in for the actual dinosaur anatomy.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much, Johannes.
Thanks. So the next speaker.